The air was thick with the smell of lake water and pine as I stood at the edge of my dock staring at the boat that had been my refuge for years. The wood beneath my feet creaked softly, and the hum of crickets filled the night as I traced the familiar shape of the vessel with my eyes. It was not just a boat, it was a memory. It was my father's gift, a legacy that reminded me of every summer we spent fishing, laughing, and sitting under fading orange. Sun, I breathed in deep, but the peace was shattered. When I heard the sharp slap of paper against my door, I turned quickly and saw a man striding away, his smug posture unmistakable. A letter flapped in the breeze, held in place by a piece of tape. I tore it free, my stomach tightening as I read the bold words. The HOA demands that you immediately remove the unauthorized watercraft from the lake. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and legal consequences. I blinked in disbelief. My hands trembled as my chest burned with anger. This was my dock, my property. My father built this place with his own 2 hands, and no smug, neighborly dictator could erase that. The next morning, I marched toward the cul-de-sac where Gerald Whitmore, the self-appointed king of our neighborhood, awaited. His polished loafers gleamed as he stood beside his pristine car, arms folded with that familiar sneer. He was in his late 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, and always dressed like he was attending a corporate board meeting. He lived for power. The HOA was his empire, and every resident was a pawn in his game. "Gerald," I said, holding the letter up like an accusation, "care to explain why this was on my door?" He smiled without warmth, tilting his head as if speaking to a child. "Rules are rules." He said, "Your little boat is an eyesore and against community guidelines. Move it or pay up." "That boat is on my private dock." I shot back, "It is not community property, and it is not breaking any rules." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You think private means untouchable. Let me educate you. This lake belongs to the community. You are not above the board. You will comply, or you will pay daily fines until you learn." A few of his lackeys, board members with smug faces, stood nearby, whispering and laughing. As if rehearsed, the humiliation burned through me. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. My father always told me never to fight with fists when words and patience could strike harder. So I asked calmly, "And what about the other boats docked on the lake, the ones owned by your friends? Why are they allowed?" Gerald leaned in close, his cologne stinging my nose. "Because I decide who stays and who goes. And you, my dear neighbor, are not on that list." He turned sharply, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as his entourage followed like shadows. I stood frozen, the paper crumpled in my hand, fury coiling in my chest like a storm. That night I sat on the dock staring at the boat. Under the pale glow of the moon, the wood was smooth under my fingers. The water, lapping gently against the hull of the boat, had carried me through grief. When my father passed, it was more than fiberglass and paint. It was memory, heritage, comfort. The idea of it being stripped away by a man drunk on control made my blood boil. Neighbors passed quietly on the path, some offering sympathetic glances, but no one dared speak up against Gerald. He had a reputation of punishing dissenters with fines and citations until they broke. He thrived on fear. He smiled when people caved and bent their heads. He believed he was untouchable. But as I traced the lines of the boat and listened to the water, I felt something change inside me. I realized I was not afraid. Not anymore. Gerald had crossed the line when he mocked my father's memory. He had no idea what he had ignited. The lake was still dark, the night air heavy. I could hear my own breath steady and sharp. The letter still lay beside me, wrinkled from my grip. I stared at it with a new kind of clarity. This was not just about a boat. This was about power and control. This was about a man who believed he owned everything and everyone around him, and it was about to become a battle he could never win. I whispered to the night, words meant only for me. He thinks he can force me off this lake. He has no idea what storm he just unleashed. The first fine arrived the next morning, folded neatly inside an envelope stamped with the HOA crest. I tore it open at my kitchen table, the words blurring as fury welled inside me. $50 a day until boat was removed. Each line carried Gerald's arrogance. I could almost hear his smug voice as I read it. The following day, another envelope appeared, then another. By the end of the week, the stack sat on my counter like a monument to his harassment. Neighbors began to whisper when I walked past them, lower their eyes, quickly afraid to be seen speaking with me. Others gave brief nods of sympathy. One old man leaned close and muttered, "Gerald's got everyone under his thumb, best not to make waves." I forced a smile, but inside I burned. Gerald thrived on fear. He collected obedience the way others collected stamps. By the weekend, his true hypocrisy gleamed under the hot sun. I sat on my porch watching as Gerald and his cronies gathered the water with their gleaming rods and coolers. They were loud, their voices carrying across the lake. Their fishing club cluttered the shoreline. with folding chairs, and beer cans boats lined the dock. There's not fine, there's not frettin'. I watched Gerald strut along the pier barking orders, laughing with his friends. My boat sat quiet, dignified and still, while his gang turned the lake into a carnival. The double standard was clear enough to make my teeth ache. I decided to face him head on. The next HOA meeting was crowded, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and disinfectant. I sat near the front folder of documents in my lap. When Gerald called the meeting to order, his voice rang with rehearsed authority. He spoke of neighborhood beautification of property value and community pride. Then, with a smirk, he introduced the issue of unauthorized boats. I stood before he could continue. I held up the deed to my property, my voice sharp and steady. This dock is privately owned. This boat is on private property. The HOA does not have jurisdiction here. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into a predator smile. He tapped his pen against the table before speaking, as if savoring the moment. Private or not, he said, your boat faces a lake. The community sees it, and therefore is within our scope. You may wave your papers around, but rules are rules. I refused to sit down. I listed statutes from the bylaws, cited county property maps, showed photographs of other boats belonging to board members. Gerald cut me off with a wave of his hand, chuckles rippling through the board. Behind him, one leaned over and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, rules are rules. Unless you're on the board. Laughter filled the space, heat rising in my chest. The humiliation stung sharper than the fines. They wanted to break me publicly, reduce me to silence. But as I met the eyes of my neighbors, I saw something else flicker there. A handful looked disgusted, not with me, but with them, with him. After the meeting, I walked out into the cool night air. My neighbor Linda caught up to me, her eyes darting nervously around. Before she spoke, Gerald is overstepping. She whispered, I know something you should hear. Her voice trembled, but her words carried fire. That fishing club of his is not even registered. He collects dues, runs tournaments, leaves trash everywhere, and none of it is legal. If the county finds out, it could all come crashing down. Her words struck me like lightning. For a moment, the world around me quieted, until all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Gerald had mocked me in front of everyone, believing himself untouchable, but he had his own cracks in the armor, his club, his pride, his empire built on lies and arrogance. I thanked Linda, her hand shaking as she squeezed mine. Before hurrying away, I stood there under the streetlight, the glow washing over the anger carved deep inside me. My humiliation from the meeting melted into resolve. Gerald thought the game was his. He believed he wrote the rules. He had no idea I had just been handed the key to his downfall. I walked home with the night alive around me, crickets chirping, the lake lapping softly at the shore. My boat gleamed in the moonlight, a quiet reminder of what I was fighting for. Every step I took carried more certainty, more clarity. The battle had shifted the fines, the humiliation, the laughter. None of it mattered anymore, because now I knew where to strike. As I sat once more at the edge of the dock, the cool water brushing against the wood, I whispered the promise to myself. If Gerald wanted me off this lake, he was about to lose far more than he ever imagined. The nights grew longer as I buried myself in research, hunched over my desk with maps, deeds, and bylaws spread out like battle plans. The glow of my laptop bathed the room in pale light. As I traced property lines with my finger, my pulse quickening each time the truth became clearer. Gerald had no jurisdiction over my dock, none at all. My father had secured deeded access decades ago, and the language was ironclad. It was a fortress against the very tyranny Gerald pretended to wield. The more I read, the more the anger inside me transformed into something sharper. Calculation, strategy, resolve. I dove deeper into county ordinances, discovering that any organized use of the lake required permits and safety clearances. Fishing tournaments, especially ones charging entry fees, had to be registered with the Department of Natural Resources. Gerald's little empire was a house of cards. He had not filed a single permit, not one. His fishing club operated like a shadow business, profiting from the lake while trampling the rules he weaponized against everyone else. The irony was almost too much to bear. He had mocked me, publicly sneered that rules were rules, but his entire operation was a violation. Every meeting, every banner, every entry fee was evidence against him. The hypocrisy tasted sweet and bitter all at once. I began collecting proof, photographing the trash they left behind, the beer bottles scattered on the shoreline, the loudspeakers blaring across the water, while neighbors tried to sleep. I recorded videos of his tournaments, boats clogging the water. As Gerald strutted with a megaphone, pretending to be king of the lake, each clip was another nail in the coffin. I built a dossier thick and undeniable. Each document, each photograph, each ordinance, carefully arranged. My plan took shape like a storm, gathering momentum, quiet at first, but destined to roar When I felt ready, I drafted an anonymous report and sent to the county enforcement office and the Department of Natural Resources. My hands trembled as I hit send, not with fear, but with anticipation. Days passed like coiled springs. Every time I heard laughter from the lake, my resolve hardened. Gerald paraded around, as if untouchable his club, louder than ever, perhaps emboldened by his victory at the HOA meeting, but arrogance blinds, and his was blinding him completely. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already crumbling. The timing had to be perfect. I learned that the fishing club was preparing for their annual tournament, the grand event of their calendar. Dozens of boats would arrive, banners strung across the dock, Gerald at the center barking orders like a general. It was a crown jewel of his year, and I knew it would be the perfect stage for his downfall. I spent the evening before the event on my dock, the water reflecting the faint glow of the moon. My boat sat calm and proud, a silent witness to the storm about to break. I could hear faint laughter from across the lake. Gerald and his men preparing coolers and gear as if nothing could touch them. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with anticipation. Every plan has a heartbeat, and mine was pounding steadily in the dark. The morning arrived with a burst of activity. The lake buzzed with engines and shouts. Boats slid across the water, banners fluttered with pomp and arrogance. Spectators gathered along the shore. Gerald stood tall with his megaphone, announcing the rules of the tournament. His voice boomed over the lake, dripping with pride. He strutted as if he were mayor of the water, his smile wide, his gestures grand. I watched from my dock, silent, unseen, my lips curling into a faint smile. Because I knew the clock was ticking, officials were on their way. The evidence I had delivered was undeniable, and the county would not ignore it. I leaned back against the wooden post of the dock, listening to hum of the engines and the shrill call of the megaphone somewhere in the distance. I thought I heard the faint wail of sirens carried on the breeze. My pulse quickened. The tournament surged forward, anglers cheering, boats jockeying for space. Gerald raised his hands like a conductor leading a symphony of chaos. He believed he was invincible, basking in the attention of his followers. My neighbors, some curious, some resentful, stood on the shore, watching the spectacle. Few dared speak against him, but I could see frustration in their faces. They were tired of his arrogance, though none would admit it aloud. Then the moment arrived. The distant sound grew louder, sirens slicing through the air. My heart leapt as the officials appeared on the horizon, their vehicles pulling up to the access point, their presence commanding attention. Heads turned, whispers rippled across the crowd. Gerald lowered his megaphone, confusion flashing across his face as uniformed officers stepped onto the dock. I remained still, hidden in plain sight, as the first officer raised a clipboard and began to speak. The fishing club was operating without permits. The tournament was unauthorized. The fines would be severe and immediate. The lake was being closed, all unregistered activity effective. At once the crowd erupted in gasps. Gerald sputtered, his face turning crimson. He tried to argue, raising his voice to protest, but the officer cut him off firmly. The law was not on his side. The sight filled me with quiet satisfaction. He had mocked me, he had humiliated me, and now he stood exposed in front of everyone, his arrogance stripped bare, his empire collapsing before his eyes. The lake that he claimed as his kingdom was slipping away faster than water through cupped hands. I watched as the officials moved through the crowd, documenting the boats, instructing them to leave the water. Spectators pulled out their phones, recording every second. Some whispered eagerly, some laughed. Quietly, Gerald shouted, tried to push past an officer, and was swiftly restrained. The image of him, red-faced and helpless, seared into memory. I took one last breath of the evening air before turning away. The storm I had unleashed was only beginning, but its roar was already undeniable. The downfall had started, and Gerald had no idea just how deep it would cut. The lake was chaos. Boats rocked against the waves as officials ordered them back to shore. Their banners sagged, their loudspeakers silenced. Neighbors stood in stunned silence, while phones flashed, capturing every humiliating second. Gerald tried to rally his club, shouting over the din, but his voice cracked under the weight of panic. His confident swagger melted into frantic gestures, his hands waving desperately as if he could command the tide back into place. His eyes darted from one officer to another, his words tripping over themselves. He claimed misunderstanding. He claimed authority. He claimed special rights, but each excuse crumbled against the cold recitation of law. One officer read aloud the charges: operating without permits, running illegal tournaments, collecting money without license. Each word was a dagger, sinking deeper into Gerald's pride. The crowd shifted, whispers building like ripples across the lake. I saw neighbors exchanging glances, their resentment finally finding voice. One man muttered loud enough for others to hear, rules are rules. Gerald faces turned his way, nodding murmurs, spreading the phrase cut through the air, turning Gerald's own weapon against him. Gerald snapped. He lunged toward the officer, his face twisted with fury. His voice boomed across the dock. "You cannot tell me what to do. This is my lake. This is my community." But the officer stepped forward, hand raised firm. An unshaken Gerald shoved him rage, blinding his reason. The crowd, gas phones lifted higher, capturing every frame. Officers swarmed, restraining him. As his body twisted against their grip, his voice broke into a desperate roar, then fell into muffled curses as they hauled him back. The humiliation was absolute. His carefully constructed image shattered before the very people he sought to dominate. Neighbors who once trembled and now smirked, others laughed, openly delight in their eyes as the tyrant was dragged away. The irony was thick. The man who had prided himself on order, discipline, and power was reduced to a spectacle of disgrace. As Gerald was led to the waiting vehicle, his board members scrambled, faces pale. Some tried to defend him, muttering excuses about clerical errors and misunderstandings, but no one believed them. Their words sounded hollow against the echo of sirens. One by one, they slipped away, blending into the crowd, their power evaporating like mist over the water. I stood at the edge of my dock, my boat gleaming under the fading sun, untouched, because it had never been under their control at all. The sight of Gerald Red, face restrained and broken, filled me with satisfaction deeper than any fine or revenge could offer. Justice had been served not by fists, not by rage, but by truth and patience. The following week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Their voices were subdued, stripped of arrogance. They issued a written apology, circulated to every household, acknowledging overreach and mismanagement. They promised reforms, they promised transparency, but their words carried no weight. The damage was done. Gerald was finished. His reign of fear ended not with triumph, but with humiliation. News spread quickly beyond the neighborhood. The video of his outburst traveled through social media, shared and mocked across community groups. A meme appeared of him shouting with the caption, "My lake, my rules." Neighbors laughed, children whispered jokes. His name turned into a punchline. The very image he cultivated as a man of authority became his downfall, immortalized in ridicule. Within a month, Gerald put his house on the market. His once immaculate lawn grew patchy, as if even the grass refused to obey him anymore. His windows stayed dark, blinds drawn. He avoided eye contact with neighbors who once cowered before him. Now they met his gaze boldly, free from fear. His empire had crumbled completely. I walked the shoreline, often my steps light, my chest unburdened each time I passed the dock. I laid a hand on the boat, its surface warm under the sun. It was more than a vessel. It was proof that some battles are won not by shouting louder, but by striking where arrogance is weakest. I thought of my father, the lessons he left me about patience, about dignity, about knowing when to fight and when to wait. The lake was quiet again, birds dipping into the water, fish leaping against the golden light of evening. Families gathered without fear, children laughing free of Gerald's shadow. The water sparkled as if cleansed of his presence. My boat rocked gently, its reflection strong and steady. I felt the weight of victory, not in glory but in peace. On the final evening of summer, I stood at the stern of the horizon, painted with fire. As the sun dipped low, the lake stretched before me, calm, endless, eternal. I thought of Gerald somewhere far away, nursing the wound of pride that would never heal. He had tried to strip me of my heritage, my father's gift, my peace. Instead, he lost everything. I let the silence linger, the waves brushing softly against the hull. Then, with a small smile, I whispered to the lake, "They wanted me gone, but I am still here, and now more than ever this place belongs to me." As the sun vanished and the first stars broke across the night sky, I laughed softly to myself, the kind of laugh that carried freedom, and certainly the kind of laugh that said justice had been done. Then I added one final thought, spoken into quiet air. Funny thing about power, when you misuse it, it sinks faster than a boat with no plug.